divide his land, from which he drew his income, into half. One half would be his income, the other half would go for payment of the warriors who secure your whole area militarily.
By the 10th and 11th centuries, the heads of some samurai families controlled huge tracts of land and had become powerful warlords in command of vast armies of warriors. They battled each other for dominance, and it was only a matter of time before one of these strong leaders would attempt to brush the imperial family aside and seize the throne for himself. For coming generations, this grab for power would shape the samurai. Miura Hiromichi restores historical samurai armor. Just like the knights of medieval Europe, samurai wore suits of protective plating to deflect arrows and sword slashes. Miura is one of a handful of highly skilled artisans sought out by museum curators to restore early suits of armor that are now considered national treasures. Wealthy patrons also commissioned him to replicate famous pieces for their personal collections.
This is how armor from the medieval period was worn. This is the fully armed samurai of that period. The helmet, the sleeve shields, the lower armor, sword, bow, and arrow quiver. And here is an attendant wearing an abbreviated version of the armor called hara-ate.
Except for the helmet, samurai armor usually wasn't made of metal like its European equivalent. Instead, it was made of dense sections of leather, layered for added strength and covered in lacquer to protect them from the humid Japanese climate. The leather sections, called kozane, were woven together with colored silk.
Constructing one suit of armor took a large amount of silk, about 250 yards, and it took about 3,000 pieces of leather. That's a lot of materials.
Because samurai armor was made of leather, it was relatively lightweight and flexible, ideal for use on horseback and in hand-to-hand fighting.
It wasn't just for fighting on the battlefield. There was a Japanese sense of beauty in it. It was made beautifully. It's been said by many that the armor was a costume to die in. But actually, Japanese armor was a costume to be worn in the celebration parade after victory in war. That's my belief.
By the late 12th century, such wartime victories had come most often to a legendary clan of samurai warriors named Minamoto. For years, the Minamoto had served as a sort of enforcement arm of the imperial court. As other samurai clans in remote regions had amassed significant power, their leaders oftentimes had grown resentful of government authority. Some clans had actually risen in rebellion, and one samurai leader had even attempted to establish a parallel empire of his own. In many of these cases, the imperial court had sent the strong and loyal Minamoto family to bring the rebels into line. Over the years, this potent family produced some renowned samurai figures. One of the most famous was Minamoto Tametomo. Tametomo is considered possibly the greatest archer in samurai history.
He's supposed to have been a giant, well over 6 feet tall. His left arm is supposed to have been 6 inches longer than his right arm, which means that he's got an unusually long bow draw.
Indeed, legend has it that he once sank an enemy boat with a single shot. In 1156, the reigning Japanese emperor died, and a deadly rift developed within the imperial family regarding which male heir would ascend to the throne. Warriors from leading samurai families fought for both factions. When the dust settled, Minamoto Tametomo found himself on the losing side. The victors exiled him to a remote island and later sent forces by boat to kill him. In a token act of defiance, Tametomo fired a few arrows from shore at the boats of his approaching attackers. The last arrow struck one of the boats near the waterline, penetrated the wooden hull, and sank the vessel. Still, with many more boats closing in, Tametomo knew his fate was sealed. Determined not to die at the hands of his enemies, he left the shore and took his own life, and he did it in a particularly gruesome manner. Tametomo committed harakiri, which literally means belly cutting. He plunged a blade into one side of his abdomen, sliced across, and then made a second cut from top to bottom, virtually ensuring a slow, agonizing death. The act was so incredibly painful and took such courage to perform, it was a way for him to prove that he was taking his own life to save his honor, not simply out of cowardice. While Tametomo was not the first warrior to take his own life in this way, his name is the first associated with the extreme act. In later centuries, harakiri, also known as seppuku, would become commonplace among defeated samurai and would evolve into a complex ritual governed by many rules. It would even include a second participant armed with a sword. This so-called second would automatically behead the dying man to shorten his suffering.
There are some people who believe there are only 3 proper ways to cut. One would be one horizontal line, at which case the second would probably behead him. The second would be 2 crossing lines. Again, everything would be in the lower abdomen. The third would be 3 horizontal lines, the third being the most difficult. If you imagine cutting across and pulling up, cutting across again and pulling up, cutting across back this way. And that might be enough for a man just to die, just to expire there.
A lot of theories as to why this particular form of suicide becomes popular. Japanese language and Japanese culture has a lot of expressions dealing with the belly as the kind of center of emotions and such. The same way that English speaks of somebody with a big heart or a black heart, Japanese will speak of someone with a big belly or a black belly. And so there may be something to the idea of ripping your belly open and saying, see, it's not black.
In the years following Tametomo's death, his nephew, Yoritomo, led the Minamoto clan to a position of supreme military power in Japan. In 1192, the emperor dubbed Yoritomo shogun, an ancient title given to generals before the time of the samurai, who were sent out to subdue barbarians at the edges of the empire. The title had always been a temporary one, but Yoritomo would make it permanent. As Japan's ultimate military leader, Yoritomo exercised more practical and administrative power than the imperial court itself. Eventually, the state of affairs in Japan became similar to the one found in England today, in which the royal sovereign is merely a figurehead, and the parliamentary prime minister actually runs things. To escape court politics in Kyoto, Yoritomo set up a parallel government run by samurai in Kamakura, just south of modern-day Tokyo. But this shogun-led government, or shogunate, never pushed the emperor aside completely. There was really no alternative.
The emperors were not really seen as having political authority. The emperors were more seen as the high priest of the country. You could compare the emperors to a certain extent with the popes of Europe. I mean, you can go and kill a king, but to kill a pope is a problem because he is the source of authority, of religious authority, and the political leadership needed that religious authority, without which they couldn't rule.
Despite Minamoto Yoritomo's grand successes, peace in Japan would not last. As an old samurai adage wisely cautioned, after victory, tighten your helmet cords. Feuding among clans would continue, and another threat, one that was not homegrown, loomed on the horizon. In the year 1274, the people of Japan faced a grave threat from mainland Asia. The ferocious Mongol regime that had conquered Korea and China over the last century was, again, looking to expand its empire.